It's okay. Slides are unimportant. So do you follow the discussion about being a better technical interviewer and how technical interviews are totally broken and we need to fix them? So I do, and I find it really fascinating. But I kind of think that we skirt around these two big problems. And the first one is that most technical interviewers are bad. And the second one is that we think we learn a lot more than we actually do from technical interviews. So I'm going to talk mainly about one. And so I just want to be clear that this talk is about process, not about outcomes. It's about us as individuals, not about broken systems, although I think the talk about broken systems is a really important one to have. And I think if we follow a process that is respectful to the people we interview, that we can feel better about the outcomes, even if those outcomes don't change. Hopefully, it's a process that means that the people that participate in it, they feel less bad about it, right? And I'm not going to make grandiose claims here, because if you apply for a job that you really want and you don't get it, that totally sucks, right? But doesn't it suck that much more when it feels like your interviewer never, like none of your interviewers ever really wanted to speak to you in the first place? So essentially, I'm going to expand on Camille's point from earlier, which was don't be a jerk. I have a great slide. Hopefully you'll see it at some point. This guy's doing his best, thank you. But it turns out that people react much more positively to things that are framed. Oh, yay! It turns out that people react better to things that are framed positively, right? So actually, I'm going to tell you to be empathetic, right? But that's a kind of like general, broad piece of advice, and maybe some of you here are asking, but how do I be empathetic, right? It's all right, you don't have to put your hands up in a minute. So empathy is something that we feel, but we can set ourselves up for empathy, right? And so I think that comes from knowing ourselves. So the way that I approach this is I think about it as it's really easier for me to be considerate of other people when I feel like my own needs are being met. But, empathy in this context, it's kind of useless, right? It's nice if we feel whatever. But actually what we want to do is we want to apply this empathy. Right? And so how do we apply empathy here? Well, one thing that we do is that we understand bias. Because we can use bias to make people feel better about what's going on, but we don't want to use bias we don't want bias to impact our conclusions. So if we're going to know ourselves, what do we need to think about? Well, if we're going to speak to someone for the best part of an hour, what are our own needs in that context? So here's one. Maybe that we actually have an hour to speak to them. If someone's interviewing for a job, that's probably the most important thing they're doing that day. And it's I feel like it's only fair to reflect that in our own schedule and to make sure that we have that time, that we have a little before and a little afterwards. One of my friends, we were talking about this, and she was telling me that before she interviews anyone, she goes to sit in this secret garden for 15 minutes. What a beautiful way to get in the right mindset. So what else might we need, right? Well, we could refer to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because we've all heard about being hungry, right? Is anybody hungry right now? It's nearly lunchtime. But did you know that lack of sleep affects your morality? So this is not exactly true. I'm gonna explain. So there's this study that took 26 healthy adults, and it asked them a series of questions. And then first when they were well rested, and then after they stayed awake for 53 hours straight, they were asked again. And these were military personnel, so presumably they had practice, because I'm pretty sure if I stayed awake for 53 hours, I would just die. But anyway, so these questions, they range from things like, is it okay to change the recipe for a chocolate brownie mix? To complex moral quandaries like, when should we let one person die so that other people live? So, of course, this was published, and the headline was these things, sleep deprivation affects your morality. But actually, people gave the same answers. It just took them longer when they were sleep deprived. And do you know the biggest predictor of whether a prisoner will be released on parole? It's whether they're hungry. No, it's how many decisions they made from when they last ate. So it ends up being time of day, but strictly it's the number of cases that they've seen, right? And so there's other interesting things here, right? So the average unfavorable decision took less time than a favorable one, and it also took more time to explain favorable decisions than it did to explain unfavorable ones in terms of the number of words used. So I feel like techies, we often like to think that we're really just one step away from the computer. We're all tech leads here. Maybe we've accepted some hard truths about ourselves and think there's maybe two, right? But I think we have to get real, right? We're like other humans, and we have the same limitations as other humans. And it's really worth being aware of what those are. So now let's talk about being in the right headspace. So I think about this as believing that the person that you're about to interview is a competent person who is more than capable of doing this job. And so I try to enter in this mind space. And so one thing to do here is to proactively get rid of things that are challenging that assumption. So I tend to do a pretty standard algorithms and data structures interview. And so I stopped reading resumes. And I stopped reading resumes for two reasons. And so the first reason is that for that kind of interview, the resume was just a bias vector. And it didn't have any meaningful effect on the kind of interview we were going to do, because we were going to talk about algorithms and data structures. And the second reason is that resumes are like sales documents for humans, right? So I would read this resume, similar to the way that I read the program for today, and I would go, I'm not qualified to speak to this person. And then I would go in feeling super intimidated and really stressed. And it wasn't setting me up to be a good interviewer for them. So one thing I do with a couple of startups is I help them with their technical interview process. And startups who are growing fast, they really need concrete help. So one thing I do is I do technical phone screens for them. And so I had one of my clients, and they had this really high no-show rate. And it was getting me into this terrible mindset, because I was so used to people not showing up, and it was really stressing me out. And so eventually I sent them this email, and I said, look, your no-show rate is really high. I'm going to have to start charging you for no-shows. I'd tried some other things first, right? And so there was this was a great way to get them to be really serious about reducing their no-show rate, so it was very effective for that. But the reason why I sent it, and the reason why, and the big difference it made to me, was actually that it fixed my headspace problem. I stopped feeling really stressed and resentful about all the no-shows. I just added them to next month's invoice, and the next person I interviewed, I was I assumed they were going to show up. So now let's talk about being empathetic. So we're going to talk about a functional kind of empathy, almost fake it until you make it kind of empathy. And step one is about being in a state of warmth. So I'm going to explain the raccoon in a moment. There's a book called The Charisma Myth, which I really recommend, but we're going to do something together to illustrate the state of warmth. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and introduce yourself, but don't do it yet, okay? First, I'm going to make you seem nicer. There's a bit too much laughter here. Are you all terrible people? I haven't met many of you yet. Okay, so, all right. This is a raccoon riding a crocodile or an alligator. Who cares? It's a scary thing with large teeth, right? My goal in life is to be as awesome as this raccoon. right? I'm like, look at this raccoon, and I'm just like filled with admiration for like an animal that could be simultaneously so adorable and so badass, right? Okay, great. So now stand up. There's a reason for this. We have more energy when we stand up. Oh, like everyone did. You're so obedient. What will I use this power for? Okay. So now, for those of you who don't have someone who in your life who you like really love, I've provided you this raccoon. For other people, I was talking to Camille earlier, and she was like, I don't understand why you like raccoons so much. And I was like, well, you'll be okay for this exercise because I know you're married and have a child. Okay, so I want you to think about your like child or your spouse or your parent or your pet or your favorite cuddly toy, just like something that you really, really love. Yeah, close your eyes, take a deep breath in, let it out. Just like you're filled with this feeling of like love and affection for the raccoon or the raccoon equivalent in your life. All right. And so now I want you to keep this feeling of warmth with you, and I want you to turn to the person next to you and say, hi, how are you doing? And I want you to like extend this feeling of warmth to them, right? This may be your best opportunity to make a new friend. Okay, go. You can sit down now. Yeah. Did anyone feel the difference between the way that you normally introduce yourself? Anybody? Do you feel like you've made a new friend for life? You know, follow up with them later, right? So there's other fake it until you make it strategies, right? And so we can also think about some of these as like basic manners. So, you know, when you speak to someone, you can say, how are you today? And you can like care about the answer, right? And another thing you can do is you can say, is now still a good time to talk? You know, and you mean it, right? And so this is great because if someone's laptop is broken, the sooner I know about that, just like functionally for me, the less time we're gonna waste because I'm gonna have to call them when their laptop's fixed anyway. And you know, so that's a really good thing if they feel like they can tell me that sooner. But then you just have to be prepared for like, I mean, so one time I asked someone if now was still a good time, and the answer I got was, well, my girlfriend's still getting ready, so can we maybe talk when she's finished blow drying her hair? But you know, I meant what I said, so you know, we pushed the time back and it was fine. Anyway. And another thing we can do is we can say, was that not clear? Let me explain it again. And we can be happy to explain it again, right? So let's talk about the last one for a minute, right? Because in any relationship where there's a power dynamic, the person with the most power has the most influence on how good that relationship is. And that means as an interviewer, you have the most power. And whether you and the interviewee build a good rapport, that is mostly on you. So, you know, your interviewee did not come in determined to hate and misunderstand you. You know? And so if you just take this approach where you assume that they're doing their best and you're like really sympathetic, then, and you know, interviewing is horribly stressful, you know, and you just feel sympathetic to that, you'll build a much better relationship with them. So, I mean, there's another caveat here from one of my hilarious stories from the millions of interviews I've done lately. I think I maybe did too well at this with one guy, and then I think he started possibly flirting with me. Because he was like, I really feel like we made a connection today, and I want to speak to you again. And I'm like, okay. I haven't spoken to him since. So and you know, I try to take that as a sign that like I'm like achieving my goals of like building this connection, and it's just like a random side effect, you know. Okay, the final step applying our empathy. And this is where understanding bias comes in. So there's a lot of discussion about bias. Camille mentioned it earlier. But like, bias is essentially the human condition. And sometimes it works for us, and sometimes it works against us. And so if you want to kind of understand how bias can be used to like manipulate our experience so that we have a better one, look at the way that Disney approaches queuing. It's genius. But if you want to understand how bias works against us, look at race relations and policing in America. It's appalling. So what we want to do here when we're interviewing is we want to use bias to make people feel better, but then we want to make sure that we remove bias from our conclusions. So one way that we can use bias is that endings are disproportionately important to how people feel about the experience. So, obviously for Disney, they have a ride at the end of it, which is like inherently awesome, and the rest of us do what we can. So, think about that raccoon again. God, I love that raccoon. And the feeling of warmth, it was so great to speak to you. Thank you so much for making time. Right? Another way to use bias is that people feel better about situations where they have some kind of control. So we can look for places where they can make choices, whether it's like programming language or approaches to solving it. You can look for places where they make choices. I was speaking to someone recently, and their interview process, they say, you can do this take-home assignment, or you can come in for whiteboarding interviews. It is totally up to you. And one thing he told me was that whichever one people choose, they feel great about it. Well, and I'm like, well, of course, you gave them a choice. They got to choose whatever it was they felt would set them up best to be successful. So now, removing bias. And this is like, how I called this talk 12 challenging steps to being an interviewer? This is the part where I like drop kind of one step on you, but it's like really, really huge. But it's okay, because I'm also going to provide you with a reading list. So for me, like, removing bias is this three-pronged approach. So the first one is allocating time in my schedule to write up my feedback immediately after I speak to someone. The second one is taking detailed notes about timings and what was happening, so that when I'm writing up my notes, I don't say, oh, I kind of felt like this took a long time. I can look at my notes and be like, it was actually only 2 minutes, so maybe not. Or like, if I feel like I gave them a lot of very specific hints, I can look back and be like, did I or didn't I? And I know exactly what those hints were. And so the third one is taking an extra pass through at the end, which is like my bias removal pass. And the first thing I look for is conclusions I can't support. Do you remember that second thing at the beginning about how we think we learn more than we do? This is where I try and address that. And the other one is gendered or racially biased feedback. So, lacking confidence. I just don't want to hear that another woman lacks confidence. I'm done with it. Aggressive. Suggestions that someone is more junior than they actually are. You have to kind of do your research here to find out those words that we're much happier to use about women and minorities, and those conclusions that we're much more ready to draw, and kind of get them out of your own feedback. And so you could spend a 2-day workshop on that. This is the most challenging step. So I want to show you something that I found hilarious. It's a snippet from an article about the Google age discrimination lawsuit. So I found it hilarious because I thought age discrimination would look different. And this actually, well, I'm going to read it to you and you'll see. The interviewer was 10 minutes late to the call, barely fluent in English, and used a speakerphone that did not function well. Heath politely asked him repeatedly to use the phone's headset, but the request was denied. Consequently, Heath and the interviewer had difficulty understanding each other. One part of the interview involved writing a short program to find the answer to a problem posed by the interviewer. Heath accomplished the task and offered to share it via Google Docs or email, but instead the interviewer required Heath to read the program coding over the phone. It did not go well. The interviewer seemed not to understand what was being read. So, like I said, I found this funny because I really thought an age discrimination suit would look different, and this just looks like a really terrible interviewer, right? He was rude, he was lacking empathy, he was really resentful of having to do it at all, and, what do you learn about someone's ability as an engineer when this is the kind of process you put them through? Maybe how they react to having their time wasted and being set up to fail, but what kind of environment is that helpful for? I find that thought very alarming. So, this guy lawyered up, good luck to him. And I share this with you to emphasize the power that we have as interviewers. We can give people a truly terrible experience, and we can gain very little useful information from it. Or we can set people up to succeed, give them the best experience we can, and learn as much as possible from it. So it's really hard work. I hope I've given you some starting points. And I just want to make the point that for me, this is not a one-time thing. This is a process that I continually work to live up to. And I really hope for you, when you next interview for a job, your interviewer is this considerate and is respectful of you. Here's your reading list. Thank you very much.